June 14, 2024, the day the mask slipped. Let me tell you something most people missed. On that Friday, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs didn't just release another one of its usual diplomatic statements, it did something far more significant. It made public, in black and white, the conditions under which Moscow would consider ending its military operation in Ukraine. And buried in those conditions was a single, explosive mandated. As in, territory transfers mandated. Not negotiated. Not suggested. Mandated. Now, if you're like most Americans, you probably heard about this through the usual channels: CNN, the New York Times, the White House briefing room, and what you got was a carefully curated Russia is making outrageous demands, Putin is bluffing, and the West must stand firm. But here's what they didn't tell: this wasn't just another round of diplomatic posturing. This was Russia drawing a line in the sand, one that reveals far more about the true state of the war and the future of global power than anything coming out of Kiev or Washington. I've spent the last 4 decades studying warfare, strategy, and the brutal calculus of great power competition. I've advised generals, testified before Congress, and written books on how wars are really fought not just on the battlefield, but in the shadows of diplomacy, economics, and geopolitical maneuvering. And what I'm about to tell you isn't speculation. It's the cold, hard reality that the foreign policy establishment doesn't want you to see. So let's start with the official story. Because that's where the deception begins. The official what they want you to believe. On the surface, the Russian statement was straightforward. Moscow laid out 3 non-negotiable conditions for Ukraine's permanent neutrality: the recognition of Russia's annexation of Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, and the demilitarization of Ukraine. The White House, the State Department, and every major Western media outlet immediately dismissed these demands as unacceptable, delusional, and a non-starter. President Biden called it a sign of weakness, while NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg insisted that Russia has no right to dictate Ukraine's future. The numbers seem to back them up. Ukraine's much-hyped 2023 counteroffensive had failed to break Russian lines, but Western intelligence still claimed Russia was running out of manpower, ammunition, and economic resilience. The Pentagon estimated that Russia had lost nearly 300,000 troops killed or wounded, figures that, if true, would have crippled any other military in history. The sanctions were supposedly strangling the Russian economy, with the ruble in freefall and oligarchs fleeing the country. The narrative was Russia was desperate, and if the West just held firm, Putin would have no choice but to back down. But here's the problem with this: none of it adds up. Let's start with the casualty figures. The US and UK have been releasing these staggering numbers, 300,000 Russian dead or wounded, with such confidence that most people assume they must be true. But where do these numbers come from? Open source intelligence? Satellite imagery? Signals intercepts? No. They come from Ukrainian sources. And if you've been paying attention, you'll know that Kiev has every incentive to inflate Russian losses. Remember the early days of the war, when Ukraine claimed to have killed 10,000 Russian troops in the first week? The actual number, according to later US assessments, was closer to 5,000. That's a 100% exaggeration. So why should we trust their numbers now? Then there's the economy. The ruble isn't in freefall, it's actually stronger than it was before the war. Russia's GDP grew by 3.6% in 2023, defying Western predictions of collapse. Inflation is under control, unemployment is at historic lows, and despite sanctions, Russia is still exporting more oil than ever, just to India and China instead of Europe. The idea that sanctions are crippling Russia is a fantasy. They've adapted. They've rerouted supply chains. They've found new markets. And most importantly, they've weaponized their own economic resilience as a message to the global: the West's financial tools are not invincible. But the biggest lie in the official narrative is the idea that Russia is losing this war. Let's look at the map. When the war started in February 2022, Russia controlled about 7% of Ukraine's territory. Today, after 2 years of fighting, they control roughly 18%. That's a net gain of 11%. Now, I'm not saying this is a victory in the traditional sense. Wars of attrition are messy, costly, and unpredictable. But it's certainly not a defeat. And if you listen to the Pentagon's own leaked assessments, they'll tell you the same Russia is grinding forward, inch by inch, and Ukraine is running out of men, ammunition, and time. So why is the West still pretending that Russia is on the ropes? Because admitting the truth would force a reckoning. And that reckoning would reveal something far more dangerous than a Russian: the limits of American power. What's really happening? Here's what's actually going on. Russia's June 14 statement wasn't a bluff. It was a declaration of strategic intent. And the keyword, mandated, wasn't accidental. It was a signal to the West that Moscow is no longer interested in negotiations. It's preparing for imposition. Let me break this down. First, the territorial demands. Russia isn't just asking for recognition of the 4 oblasts it annexed in 2022. It's demanding that Ukraine formally cede them, along with any additional territory Russia captures in the future. That's not diplomacy, that's diktat. And it's not just about land. It's about strategic depth. Russia has always feared NATO action because it leaves them with no buffer. In 2014, when Ukraine first started talking about joining NATO, Putin warned that this would be a red line. The West ignored him. Then, in 2021, Ukraine actually started the process of joining NATO. That's when Putin decided he had no choice but to act. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The West keeps saying that Russia's demands are unrealistic, but that's only true if you assume the West has the power to enforce its will. And that's the problem, it doesn't. The US and Europe have poured over $200 billion into Ukraine, but for what? A stalemate. A war of attrition that's bleeding Ukraine dry while Russia, with its larger population and industrial base, can afford to outlast them. The West is betting that Putin will blink first. But what if he doesn't? Second, the demilitarization demand. This isn't just about Ukraine, it's about NATO. Russia knows that if Ukraine joins NATO, the alliance will have a 1,200-mile border with Russia, complete with American missiles, troops, and intelligence assets. That's an existential threat. And Russia has made it they will not allow that to happen. So when they say demilitarization, what they really mean is no NATO in Ukraine. Period. Now, let's talk about the real motivations behind this war, because it's not just about Ukraine. It's about the future of the international order. Russia, China, and a growing number of non-Western nations are pushing for a multipolar world, one where the US is no longer the sole superpower. They see American hegemony as a threat to their sovereignty, their economies, and their cultural identities. And they're right. The US has spent the last 30 years exiting NATO, toppling governments, and imposing its will on the world under the guise of democracy promotion. But that era is ending. The question: how will the US respond? Russia's conditions aren't just about Ukraine. They're a challenge to the entire post-Cold War order. And the West's refusal to even consider them isn't a sign of strength, it's a sign of denial. The exited geopolitical, the great power chessboard. To understand why this war is happening, and why it's not going to end anytime soon, you have to out. This isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the struggle for the 21st century. Let's start with the big picture. The US is a unipolar power in a multipolar world. For the last 30 years, America has acted as if it could dictate the rules of the international system. But that's no longer true. China is rising. Russia is resurgent. The global South is asserting its independence. And the US is struggling to adapt. Now, here's where it gets dangerous. The US foreign policy establishment, what I call the blob, is still operating under the assumption that America can maintain its dominance through military force, economic coercion, and ideological crusades. But that's a fantasy. The world has changed. And the longer the US clings to this delusion, the worse the consequences will be. Let's look at the 3 major players in this. 1. Moscow sees itself as the guardian of a Eurasian civilization, one that rejects Western liberalism in favor of traditional values, sovereignty, and a multipolar world. Putin isn't just fighting for Ukraine. He's fighting for Russia's place in the world. And he's willing to pay a heavy price to secure it. 2. Beijing is watching this war very closely. If Russia succeeds in carving out a sphere of influence in Ukraine, it sets a precedent for China's ambitions in Taiwan. If Russia fails, it sends a message that the US can still project power globally. Either way, China is hedging its bets. It's supporting Russia economically, but it's also preparing for a world where the US remains the dominant military power. 3. The United Washington is trapped in a paradox. It needs to support Ukraine to maintain its credibility as a global leader. But the more it invests in this war, the more it weakens itself elsewhere, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, where China is the real long-term threat. The US is like a boxer with two opponents, trying to punch both at once. And sooner or later, it's going to get knocked out. Now, let's talk about spheres of influence, because that's what this war is really about. The US has spent the last 30 years exiting NATO right up to Russia's borders. But when Russia tries to establish its own sphere of influence in Ukraine, the US calls it aggression. That's hypocrisy. And the rest of the world sees it. The global South, India, Brazil, South Africa, the Gulf states isn't buying the Western narrative. They see this war as a proxy conflict between the US and Russia, and they're staying neutral. Why? Because they don't want to be dragged into another Cold War. They want strategic autonomy. And that's a problem for the US, because it means the unipolar moment is over. Military and strategic, the illusion of victory. Now, let's talk about the military reality. Because this is where the West's delusions are most dangerous. The US and NATO keep saying that Ukraine can win this war. But what does win even mean? Does it mean pushing Russia out of all occupied territory? Does it mean regime change in Moscow? Or does it just mean not losing? Here's the hard: Ukraine cannot win this war militarily. Not with the current balance of forces. Russia has more men, more artillery, more missiles, and more industrial capacity. Ukraine is running out of troops. Its much vaunted counteroffensive in 2023 failed because it didn't have the manpower or the firepower to break through Russian defenses. And now, with Western aid drying up, Ukraine is in deep trouble. But here's where it gets even worse. The US is escalating this conflict without a clear endgame. We're sending long-range missiles, F-16s, and advanced drones to Ukraine, all of which Russia has warned will be seen as direct US involvement. And if Russia starts striking NATO supply lines in Poland or Romania? Then we're in a direct war with a nuclear power. Now, I've heard the hawks in Washington say, we can take on Russia and China at the same time. That's insane. The US military is stretched thin. Our defense industrial base is a shadow of what it was during the Cold War. And our allies in Europe? They're not ready for a real war. Germany just announced it's cutting its defense budget. France is distracted by domestic unrest. And the UK? It's a has-been power with a navy that can't even protect its own waters. Let me be: this is not Iraq. This is not Afghanistan. Russia is a great power with a nuclear arsenal, a massive military, and the will to use it. And if the US keeps pushing, we're going to find out just how far Putin is willing to go. The domestic political why the war won't end. Now, let's talk about the real reason this war isn't American politics. The Biden administration needs this war. Not because it's good for America, it's not, but because it's good for them. Here's 1. The 2024 Biden's team knows that if Ukraine collapses before November, it will be a disaster for his re-election campaign. So they're doing everything they can to keep the war going, even if it means escalating the conflict. They're betting that a strong-on-Russia posture will rally the base. But what happens if Russia launches a major offensive in the fall? What if Ukraine starts losing ground? That's a political nightmare. 2. The foreign policy establishment loves this war. It gives them a sense of purpose. It justifies their budgets. It keeps them relevant. And they'll do anything to keep it going, even if it means lying to the American people about the state of the conflict. 3. The military-industrial: this war is a goldmine for defense contractors. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, they're all making billions off this conflict. And they have enormous influence in Washington. So don't expect them to push for peace anytime soon. Now, here's the American people are getting tired of this war. Polls show that support for Ukraine aid is dropping, especially among Republicans. But the blob doesn't care. They're going to keep pushing until something breaks. And that's the real danger. Because if the US keeps escalating without a clear strategy, we're going to end up in a direct war with Russia. And that's a war nobody can win. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this go from here? Let's look at the three most likely. Scenario 1, the frozen conflict. In this scenario, the war grinds to a stalemate. Russia consolidates its gains in the east and south, while Ukraine holds the rest of the country. The West keeps sending just enough aid to keep Ukraine fighting, but not enough to win. The result? A frozen conflict that lasts for years, like Korea or Cyprus. This is the best-case scenario for the US, because it avoids a direct war with Russia. But it's a disaster for Ukraine, which will be left as a failed state on Europe's doorstep. Scenario 2, the Russian breakthrough. This is the most likely scenario. Russia launches a major offensive in late 2024 or early 2025, using its superior manpower and firepower to break through Ukrainian lines. Ukraine collapses, and Russia takes even more territory. The West is forced to either escalate or accept defeat. This is where things get very dangerous, because if Russia wins, it will send a message to the US can be defied. And that will embolden China, Iran, and every other adversary. Scenario 3, the Great Escalation. This is the worst-case scenario. The US and NATO decide to directly intervene in the war, sending troops, striking Russian targets, or even imposing a no-fly zone. Russia responds by using tactical nuclear weapons. And suddenly, we're in World War III. This scenario is unlikely, but it's not impossible. And if it happens, the consequences will be catastrophic. Now, let me be none of these scenarios are good. The best we can hope for is a frozen conflict. The worst? Nuclear war. And the most likely? A Russian victory that reshapes the global order. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. So how did we get here? How did the US go from the unipolar moment of the 1990s to the brink of strategic disaster in 2024? The answer is liberal hegemony, the idea that the US can and should remake the world in its own image. For the last 30 years, the US has pursued a grand strategy of global dominance. We've exited NATO, toppled governments, and imposed our will on the world under the guise of democracy promotion. But that strategy has failed. Let's look at a disaster that cost trillions of dollars and thousands of lives, and left the Middle East in chaos. A 20-year war that ended in humiliating defeat. A humanitarian intervention that turned into a failed state and a haven for terrorists. A proxy war that strengthened Russia and Iran. A conflict that's bleeding the West dry while Russia gains ground. The problem isn't just that these interventions failed, it's that they were based on a fundamental misunderstanding of power. The architects of liberal hegemony, from Clinton to Bush to Obama and now Biden, operated under the delusion that military force and economic sanctions could reshape societies in our image. But power isn't just about firepower or GDP. It's about will, cohesion, and the ability to endure pain. And on that front, the West has been losing for years. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the entire post-Cold War order. For 3 decades, the US acted as if history had ended, as if the rules of geopolitics no longer applied. We assumed that Russia would remain a weakened, compliant state, that China would liberalize, that the global South would fall in line. But that's not how the world works. The 21st century is shaping up to be an era of multipolar competition, where revisionist powers like Russia, China, and Iran are actively working to dismantle the US-led order. And they're doing it not with tanks and nukes, but with something far more patience. Let me explain why this matters. The US has spent the last 30 years fighting wars of choice, not wars of necessity. We've treated military force as a tool of social engineering, not as a last resort. And in the process, we've hollowed out our own industrial base, eroded our strategic focus, and alienated much of the world. Meanwhile, Russia has been playing the long game. While we were bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan, Putin was rebuilding the Russian military, securing his energy leverage, and cultivating alliances with China, Iran, and North Korea. He didn't need to match our defense budget, he just needed to outlast us. Here's the uncomfortable: Russia's invasion of Ukraine wasn't an act of desperation. It was a calculated gamble. Putin looked at the West's divisions, our shrinking defense budgets, our obsession with woke ideology over hard power, and he saw an opportunity. He knew that the US and Europe lacked the stomach for a prolonged conflict. He knew that our sanctions would hurt us as much as they hurt him. And he knew that if he could just hold on long enough, the West would fracture. So far, he's been right. Now, let's talk about the military implications. The war in Ukraine has exposed the limits of Western power in ways that should terrify anyone who believes in American leadership. For all our talk of unprecedented support for Ukraine, the reality is that we've been stingy with the one thing that could actually turn the long-range strike capabilities. The US has refused to provide ATACMS missiles with a range beyond 100 miles, despite the fact that Russia has been using its own long-range missiles to devastate Ukrainian infrastructure. Why? Because the Biden administration is terrified of escalation. But here's the escalation is already happening. Russia is escalating every day, with drone strikes, with sabotage, with nuclear threats. And by refusing to give Ukraine the tools it needs, we're not avoiding war, we're prolonging it. The same goes for air power. The West has sent Ukraine dozens of advanced fighter jets, but we've refused to provide the training and logistical support needed to integrate them into a coherent air defense system. Why? Because NATO doesn't want to risk a direct confrontation with Russia. But again, that's not deterrence, that's surrender. If we're not willing to fight for Ukraine, then we're not willing to fight for anything. And that's a message that's not lost on Beijing, Tehran, or Pyongyang. Now, let's out. The war in Ukraine isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the future of European security. For decades, the US has acted as Europe's security guarantor, stationing troops in Germany, Poland, and the Baltics. But that arrangement was always based on the idea that Europe could outsource its defense to America while focusing on welfare states and climate policies. That illusion is now shattered. Russia's invasion has forced Europe to confront a brutal: if the US withdraws, Europe cannot defend itself. And yet, most European countries still spend less than 2% of their GDP on defense. Germany, the continent's economic powerhouse, has been particularly delinquent, despite Scholz's so-called Zeitenwende speech in 2022. 2 years later, Germany's military is still a hollow shell, and its defense industry is incapable of producing enough ammunition to sustain Ukraine, let alone its own forces. Here's why this: if Russia wins in Ukraine, the next target will be the Baltics. And if NATO can't defend the Baltics, then NATO is finished. The alliance's credibility rests on Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause. But if the US and Europe can't muster the will to stop Russia in Ukraine, why would Putin believe we'd fight for Estonia or Latvia? The answer is he wouldn't. And that's why a Russian victory in Ukraine would be the death knell for NATO. Now, some will argue that I'm being alarmist. They'll say that Russia is too weak, that China is too cautious, that the US still has time to pivot. But that's the same kind of wishful thinking that got us into this mess. The hard truth is that the US is in strategic retreat. Our adversaries see it. Our allies see it. And they're adjusting their behavior accordingly. China is accelerating its military buildup, Iran is exiting its proxy networks, and Russia is doubling down on its imperial ambitions. Meanwhile, the US is distracted by internal divisions, economic stagnation, and a political class that's more interested in culture wars than grand strategy. So what's the way out? First, we need to accept that the era of liberal hegemony is over. The US can no longer afford to be the world's policeman. We need to shift to a strategy of offshore balancing, supporting allies when it's in our interest, but not fighting their wars for them. Second, we need to rebuild our industrial base. The US can't project power if we can't produce enough artillery shells, let alone advanced weapons systems. Third, we need to restore deterrence. That means giving Ukraine the tools it needs to win, not just to survive. And it means making it clear to Russia, China, and Iran that any further aggression will be met with overwhelming force. But here's the: none of this will happen unless the American people demand it. And right now, they're not. They're tired of war, tired of spending, tired of the world. And that's exactly what our adversaries are counting on. They know that if they can just outlast us, they'll win by default. And unless we wake up, they will.